Any meaningful story has to have a moral, or at the very least have something to say. And on top of that, the moral should be insightful and not self-destructive. Star Wars, like any other of its kind, has a message that is meant to incite us and teach us a valuable lesson. But what is that message exactly? I think it's best to focus on George Lucas's complete saga, as that's the best way to examine the message, before we get into anything else Star Wars. So Star Wars, I would say, is about the contrast between being selfless versus selfish, or the light and dark side. In many ways, it is about being good or evil, but there's obviously a lot more to it than that. Anakin, as the central character, is shown making many selfish decisions that cause the demise of many people, including himself. But the story also showed that he struggled a lot with his choices, which is practically saying that often, the right choice is not always easy, and it's always tempting to be selfish. That's basically how the dark side is treated, that it's the quick and easy way to power, but it will ultimately destroy you and make the lives of everyone around you worse. Star Wars also teaches that even if you've made bad choices, or even a lot of bad choices, you can still make the right choice in the end. Anakin chose to save his son out of love, and return to the light in the end. The reason I really hate the perception that Darth Vader is this hip and cool, all-powerful badass is because it is not the message of Star Wars, and that perception detracts from it. We should not be like Darth Vader, someone who is more machine than man, who did not care for anyone or anything, and hated himself and everyone, the epitome of misery. You could also say that Luke, being the good-natured person that he was, as soon as he learned who his father was, never gave up hope that his father could be redeemed, that he could change, and it was ultimately proven right in the end. Even Yoda and Obi-Wan had given up on hope for Anakin, and that's another thing, hope. Having hope is also a central theme of Star Wars. Even at the start of the story, Anakin had hopes as a kid of being a Jedi and freeing his fellow slaves and making the galaxy a better place. Qui-Gon, by extension, believed that Anakin was the chosen one and would bring balance to the Force. In short, Star Wars is about selflessness versus selfishness, and also optimism versus pessimism, and the story reflects this. Such as the moment where Luke insists to Vader that he can be saved, and Vader tells him it's too late. And then in the end he tells Luke that he did save him, and to tell his sister that he was right all along. If I had to pick out the two central themes, that would be it. Although I would say the former is the more important message of the two, because typically, selflessness is what inspires hope, and selfishness detracts from it. There are other messages in Star Wars as well, such as how the galaxy doesn't revolve around us, which plays into the selflessness message, and also the first half of the story, how it teaches that you must always be on the lookout for the return of evil, and to not let your guard down, otherwise it will slip right under your noses. This is demonstrated in how the Sith were gone for 1,000 years. However, the Sith returned right under the Jedi's noses 1,000 years later. And because it was so long ago, they became complacent to the return of the Sith, and fully didn't detect the threat and eliminate it until it was far too late. However, the Jedi eventually returned to destroy evil, hence the title, Return of the Jedi. This is because of selfless decisions being made by those like Luke, as well as undying hope that things could change for the better. The rebellion and the people in it did not bow down to the might of the Empire. They rose above it and restored freedom and justice to the galaxy, against the tyranny of the Empire. That's what I would call the overarching message and themes of Star Wars. Selflessness, hope, and awareness. Be selfless instead of selfish. Hold on to hope and never give it up. Be aware and not ignorant or clueless. An example of this being displayed all in one is perhaps Luke's defining decision in Return of the Jedi. After defeating Darth Vader, the Emperor tells Luke to execute him and take his rightful place at his side. Luke in this moment is selfless, as he spares Vader despite his crimes. He is hopeful, as he did so because he believed his father could be redeemed, and he was aware, knowing what the Emperor was trying to do, and decided he would not fall for it. So he threw his lightsaber away to give the galaxy's most evil man the middle finger. This is reinforced when the Emperor just opts to torture him to death, and he pleads for his father to help him, believing in the good inside him. And it works, as Anakin renounces Darth Vader and throws the Emperor off, saving his son, and the rest is history. That is the overarching story of Star Wars. Be selfless, be hopeful, be aware. And I think it's an insightful, meaningful message to teach people. I feel that Star Wars in its purest form never got distracted from this message. It was clear just by watching them that they had something to say. And George didn't make Anakin a charismatic macho man because it would detract from the message. It is also why I dislike the Clone Wars so much. Because how it approached the main central character was pretty much a short-term solution to a criticism made incessantly about the prequels, that Anakin wasn't mature and wasn't charismatic. By extension, I also hate the Clone Wars because the show tends to shrug off evil choices, such as Anakin and Obi-Wan pulling a false surrender so casually, and the show treats it like a joke, even though they violated the oldest wartime sin in the real world. False surrendering is literally the original war crime. Also, Ahsoka is a Mary Sue, and that detracts from the already mitigated revamp of Anakin Skywalker, and has literally no meaningful purpose. She gets framed for the bombing on the Jedi Temple, being betrayed by a character who has no reason to betray her, and could have framed literally anyone for the attack, and she isn't selfless, hopeful, or aware in this situation. Nor is there emphasis being placed on her being selfish, pessimistic, or clueless, in contrast with the main theme of Star Wars. If I had to look at it, it's just meant to make the Jedi look bad, through a massive mistake and scandal. The characters who actually cast Ahsoka out don't learn anything, nor is there really any emphasis placed on them for their mistake, and it mostly focuses on Anakin and Ahsoka in the aftermath. Anakin did everything right, and Ahsoka did everything right. And it just comes off as backtracking on the message that should be taught, and the one Star Wars always taught. Now obviously, we all know that George wanted Ahsoka dead, and that probably would have fit much better with the message. But leave it to Dave Filoni to sneak Ahsoka surviving past George's back. The thing is, I don't find much value in the Clone Wars, as it doesn't line up well with the films. It took the easy way out of how it depicted the prequels. And the Clone Wars multimedia project literally proved that it was not impossible to make compelling stories out of the prequel trilogy as they existed and were released. Anakin can be moody and unstable, and that can be brilliant, like the Battle of Jabeem arc. Metachlorians can be a thing, and that can work to great effect, like Darth Plagueis' experiments in his titular novel. In fact, you can create new characters to build off the old ones, like Quinlan Vos, among others. In actuality, there was nothing that the prequels broke. The idea that the prequels were incompatible with, quote, good storytelling, and that every story after it would be fundamentally broken without a lot of revisions or changes is very, very wrong. Prequel haters said that without even reading a single side story, aside from the Clone Wars. Even on the filthy casual range, Battlefront 2 proved them wrong, as the simple add-on of having Tamara Morrison give a clone's perspective on the Star Wars saga, overlaid with 2005 pre-rendered cutscenes that were literally just gameplay made to look cinematic, well,
that's the way it's done.
The Clone Wars is on the lower mid-tier of Star Wars content at best anyways. Star Wars Republic easily beats it in a duel, and Republic has a disadvantage of being a comic book, meaning that there's no sound, plus it's just stationary pictures, and it's shorter than the Clone Wars, clocking in at 83 issues, compared to the Clone Wars' 133 episodes. And it's not like Republic had some bumps on the road itself. Speaking of Republic, one of the central themes of Republic that I picked up is the difference between justice and revenge, and how it often can be confused with one another. 3 examples of this in the series is firstly, Ki-Adi-Mundi's desire for revenge against a Raider leader, that caused him and his family so much pain. To the point where his family gives him to the Jedi Order to avoid having to give him up to the Raiders as a forced tribute. He asks his Master Yoda about how he's supposed to not hate the leader for all that he has done to him, and Yoda tells him to hate the act, but pity the being, as the Raider leader has already lost his battle with the dark side. Mundi ends up trying to confront the Raider leader, only to find out there's been a change of leadership in his absence, and the former leader is now reduced to being a weakling who has to tend to the cattle. Ki-Adi-Mundi realizes that justice has already been done, and that he doesn't need to punish the then Raider leader, because he brought everything on himself, and paid the price for it. The second example comes when Quinlan Vos is deep undercover as one of Count Dooku's dark acolytes. Dooku knows what Vos is up to, and he decides to convert him from a spy to an ally by taking him to his homeworld, where his aunt rules over Kifu, and upon touching her, Quinlan has the revelation that his aunt murdered his parents when he was a kid, which was since a suppressed memory. Quinlan confronts his aunt on this, only to be met with no remorse. Then Count Dooku comes in, gives him a lightsaber, and tells him to kill her, specifically with the phrase, "Justice demands it." But what Quinlan Vos ended up doing was engaging in revenge, not justice. And Vos ended up falling to the dark side as he acted out of revenge. The third example is after the Battle of Jabim. Anakin Skywalker is sent to another battlefront, and is forced to work with Asharad Head, who is a human-born Tusken Jedi. Anakin obviously struggles to work with him, and he ends up becoming so angry that he lashes out at Head, confessing that he slaughtered a Tusken village on Tatooine, as seen in Attack of the Clones. This ends up getting Het to unmask himself, which reveals that he is a human, and states that Tuskens and humans are incompatible. So his mother must have been a human, as well as his father, who he did know. In the end, however, Het does not rat out Anakin to the Jedi over his secret. He does so because he believes that if he did, he would have relieved him of responsibility over what he had done. He then tells Anakin that what he did was not the way of the Jedi, that he acted out of anger and hate, and it was revenge, and then asks him if he had the chance, would he do it again? And Anakin coldly says yes. Star Wars Republic still has the themes of selflessness, hope, and awareness in mind, even though Republic is far more pessimistic in its portrayal of the Clone Wars. But I think it benefits the prequel trilogy because it reflects the loss of hope, and stuff like Quinlan Vos's obsession with finding the second Sith that caused him to fall to the dark side. When Quinlan Vos is redeemed, he still has to make the right choice. For example, it turns out that his lover, Colleen, was a spy for Count Dooku. And when Dooku orders Vos to execute her, she insists that, yeah, she was Dooku's spy, but then she genuinely fell in love with Vos and pleads for Vos not to kill her. Vos here engages in awareness that Colleen is telling the truth and rejects the dark side, instead giving Dooku the middle finger. I hope you're seeing a pattern here. I'll discuss more of Republic when my review comes out in the year 2037, but the writers did not forget the overarching themes of Star Wars. Then you've got the Acolyte. In case you didn't realize already, I hate this show, but there's a problem with it far larger than butchering continuity or it being woke. It is not faithful to the meaning of Star Wars. As I discussed in the review, the show tries to make the Sith sympathetic and also tries to portray the Jedi in a poor light. Basically, it has the mentality that the Jedi are not virtuous, selfless heroes who sacrifice everything for the greater good. And we should all be like the Sith, because the Sith show us what freedom to make our own choices truly is. It's pretty ass backwards, because Leslie Butthead didn't understand that there's a difference between making the right choice and freedom from consequences. The choices that Quamira's made are wrong, and with Quamir using the excuse that the Jedi say that he can't exist, and that it's oppression, and the show frames it like he has a point, it's a completely disgraceful depiction of the Jedi and the Sith. and their dynamic. It's easy for a filthy casual to look at the Sith code and just say that it's about achieving victory and whatnot, and there's nothing wrong with trying to achieve personal success, but if they actually bothered to understand the words instead of taking them at face value and then spinning it in the most positive way possible, they'd realize that the Sith are very, very wrong. To describe the Sith code, it is all about being as powerful as possible, whatever the cost. That means that if something gets in the way of the pursuit of gaining power, you should just bulldoze through it. The Sith completely forfeit compassion and love for the goal of ultimate power. Forming relationships gets in the way of one's personal power, so it must be forfeited. Fueling the dark side requires negative, strong emotions, so it must be embraced, no matter the harm it causes to others. That is the ideology of the Sith, that those who have power deserve it by the fact that they have it, and those who are weak do not even deserve to live. It's a might makes right mentality, and real Star Wars will show what happens when you tap into the dark side. It leads to tragedy, destruction, and death, and being selfless is a better option. On the other hand, being a Jedi is all about self-sacrifice, about being selfless. The Jedi Code and the actual meaning of its words teaches us to remain level-headed always and to seek wisdom to understand the world and what to do. So the Acolyte spat in the face of this message by trying to promote the idea that the Jedi are a part of the problem, or that being selfless isn't as virtuous as it seems, and that it's okay to be a little Sith-like. From a thematic standpoint, The Acolyte is perhaps one of the worst pieces of Star Wars content. Not only is the message the opposite of what George Lucas tried to teach us, but also the message that The Acolyte promotes is not insightful or useful. Teaching people to be like the Sith is an idiotic and flat-out deluded thing to teach people. The show does a terrible job at promoting all this on its own terms anyways. And you can easily tell that it's muddling the message because it can't even stay consistent with itself. The show, despite asking you to sympathize with the Sith, mostly relies on what Quamir says about how the Jedi try their hardest to make sure he doesn't exist. That's it. And it's like, oh boo-hoo. The Jedi do everything to wipe you out because you are a Sith. And it's really pathetic. It's almost like Butthead wanted to present the Sith as sympathetic, but also knew that she couldn't have Quamir do anything kind or charitable, something that would actually prove the point that the Sith aren't so bad. It's really weird to watch. And the same thing applies to the Jedi. Literally, the whole idea that the Jedi are problematic comes from a misunderstanding that the entire story is built upon. That Sol and friends made a mistake that led to disastrous consequences, although it was still a mistake, and Sol did everything to try and make up for it. Everything, except explaining himself when he's being force choked. Yeah, this story is really stupid. I already criticized it for that. The whole trope where one character reveals another character has been lying or hiding something to another character is really misplaced with who does what. The show really can't even commit to its own message, and that's part of why it's a really weak story. Because you can tell that Butthead doesn't even really believe in what she was writing that much. She basically did what she did to stand out from all the other Star Wars stories. Disney Plus shows have this weird feeling of being both uninspired and doing things to shock people with varying degrees of effectiveness at the same time. So basically, to put it short, The Acolyte doesn't have a huge emphasis on its message, and therefore, its themes are incredibly weak because they don't ring true. If there was ever a Star Wars story that was completely insincere, it was The Acolyte. And it's why I hate it so much. Because you can feel that it wasn't made out of love for Star Wars in any regard. It's just Butthead's whorehouse of destructive story decisions that completely screws over the Phantom Menace onwards. And the thing is, where people already don't understand the message of Star Wars, what they need the least is a story that spews the opposite message. It's only going to make things more confusing, since The Acolyte is officially made Star Wars content. So with that being said, I think I've made my point extremely clear. Star Wars is not a hard story to understand what it's trying to teach you. The Empire are not the good guys, and they're inspired by fascist and authoritarian regimes such as the Nazis. I used to be in the pitfall of trying to justify the Empire myself, but I grew up and realized that George Lucas clearly did not want people to think the Empire is good, or even comparable to any reasonable government in the real world. The Empire is supposed to be like North Korea with unfair laws, oppression, lack of basic rights, and no free speech whatsoever. The rebellion is meant to represent people being pushed over the edge by the Empire's tyranny and rising up against it. And not Osama bin Laden deciding to hijack 4 planes and killing innocent people to get back at the United States. The rebels are freedom fighters, not T-words. Now, I think it's fine that Disney canon has this element where some rebels are extremists, as long as the whole theme of selflessness, hope, and awareness is intact. Like, is Saw Gerrera a selfless resistance fighter who works for more than just toppling the regime? How much hope does he have that he can actually defeat the Empire? Is he aware of the severity of the choices he makes in the name of fighting the Empire? I haven't really seen any effective exploration of these questions, because Star Wars Rebels was dog shit, but the point is, I think every Star Wars story should be aware of these themes. But the thing is, Disney doesn't really see Star Wars as an important piece of fiction that tried to teach us something. They just see it as a cash cow. And it's why a lot of Disney Star Wars products are a complete disgrace, as they either ignore, misunderstand, or flat out reject the message of Star Wars in favor for the shitty new. I want to emphasize that I don't hate Disney Star Wars because it's the hip and cool bandwagon, or because I think it's woke. I hate it because they have completely forsaken the series' identity. Now look, not every good Star Wars story reflects the message, such as the Battlefront 2 campaign. But the reason why is because it's obviously meant to give an Imperial spin on things. But someone on their own should not magically change their mind about the Empire. Think about how the 501st narrator talks about the events of the films. He suggests that the 501st had doubts that the Jedi were really traitors, but they said nothing. They followed their orders regardless. The narrator also talks about how many fellow soldiers he knew that died when the Death Star was destroyed. But then he neglects to mention the obvious motive for destroying the Death Star, that the Death Star would be used to destroy planets and kill countless people, so the destruction of the Death Star was necessary, even if it killed personnel that had nothing to do with firing the super laser. They were soldiers and military personnel, so them being killed wasn't a war crime. The 501st narrator doesn't even ever look at things from the rebels' perspective. He doesn't mention the destruction of Alderaan, and in fact, he spoke of Alderaan quite poorly, stating that they were pests who were causing the Empire problems. It's meant to be a really fascist way of thinking, but also give you a window into how the Empire thought of themselves, not mentioning Imperial atrocities and trying to spin the rebel uprising in the worst way possible. Such as, I knew this soldier for 20 years and the rebels just gunned him down and now I'm angry. The 501st narrator clearly didn't question any of his orders and carried them out because he was conditioned to. So while the game doesn't promote the message of Star Wars, it's still useful in the story of Star Wars to contextualize how the nameless bad guys thought about all this. One should easily notice the way the narrator spins the rebels and props up the Empire compared to what we see in the films. One should easily notice the way the narrator spins the rebels and props up the Empire compared to what we see in the films. So with that being said, I think I fully explained the overarching message of Star Wars and how all Star Wars media should follow its example for that reason. And if any content wants to question that message, it better have some damn good arguments that give insight, and Disney Star Wars, I'm sorry to say, doesn't do that. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories about mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain. Were you praying that the law is strong?